Welcome to Ideas Matter, a podcast hosted by WashU. We live in a disorienting time. Climate change, pandemics, war, political disruptions, the rise of new technology all make this an unprecedented moment. Making sense of this cascade of change takes a public conversation that prioritizes data, expertise, and clarity of thought. Unfortunately, this is not the conversation we often get. Instead, we get a public debate that generates more heat than light, with the ideas that matter most going unheard amidst the noise. This podcast aims to help us do better. It is meant as a place for thoughtful, data-informed conversations about the ideas that are shaping our world. It's hosted by me, Sandro Galea, Dean of the School of Public Health at WashU and Vice Provost for Interdisciplinary Initiatives. Each episode, I am talking with someone who knows a lot about a big issue or idea. Guests are thinkers, leaders, and doers who are engaging with key challenges and opportunities of this moment. Thank you for joining us. Now, on to today's topic. Immigration is among the most challenging and complex issues of our time. It raises fundamental questions. What does it mean to be or want to be a citizen? What are our responsibilities to those who immigrate to the US, both legally and not legally? How do we humanely enforce immigration law and secure our borders? Or are borders themselves inherently inhumane? This topic is particularly close to home for me because I'm an immigrant twice over. My family immigrated from Malta to Canada in the 1980s, and I later immigrated to the United States. Immigration has long been part of the political conversation in the US, and yet we still seem far from any kind of stability on this issue. Is a better approach to immigration possible? I look forward to exploring this and other questions with today's guest. I'm pleased to have Dr. Alexander Kustov, an Associate Professor of Migration in the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame with us today. He studies how democracies manage immigration, ethnic relations, and demographic change. He is the author of the book, In Our Interest, How Democracies Can Make Immigration Popular. He also writes an excellent Substack newsletter, Popular by Design. I'm delighted to be speaking with Dr. Kustov today. Alex, welcome.
Thank you so much, Sandro, for having me. I'm delighted to be here as well.
It's great to have you, Alex. So let's start with asking about your background. So how did you come to do the work you're doing? Why did you choose to focus on immigration?
Yeah, I mean, there are probably a couple of things. I think most obviously it's also, my own personal background. Like yourself, I was born in the Soviet Union and I lived in Germany and Great Britain before coming to the US. I don't think that's the reason why I study immigration, though. I think what happened, just kind of going back in time and thinking through it. So when I came to grad school in 2013, I was initially actually supposed to be a scholar of ethnic and religious conflict with a regional focus on Africa. But as it usually happens, I think my advisor left for a different school. And so I had to reorient myself quite a bit. And so I kind of realized that if you think about it, like immigration is probably like the biggest ethnic conflict there is, because basically people are confronting each other based solely on their national origin or whatnot. And so I thought that that would be a good area to explore. And that's how I started the research on immigration. And then in terms of my intellectual journey, one of my kind of first papers was this, as some of my colleagues called it, the Debbie Downer paper that just shows that immigration views don't really change much, which means a lot of kind of our ways to persuade people might not be as effective as we hope them to be. And so it kind of got me a little bit depressed for a little bit about the whole endeavor. But I kind of soon came to realize that there are some good examples of popular immigration. And that's how I would say my book project and dissertation came about. And that's how I got into this whole business of writing a Substack as well.
Well, you certainly chose a challenging topic to devote your career to. So let's talk a little bit about something you wrote recently for your Substack. Your Substack, Popular by Design. You wrote The Uncomfortable Truths About Immigration. So lead us through them. What are these truths? And why are you acknowledging them? How can acknowledging them help us create better immigration policy?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I'm building on what philosopher Dan Williams calls highbrow misinformation, right? So I feel like the traditional view that a lot of scholars have in public health as well, I assume, is that we have this kind of misinformation coming from nefarious actors, usually on the kind of far right, and they just don't really care about truth or facts, and they just lie to people and they propagate their ideas, while we do have kind of the opposite situation on the other side where people want to educate and enlighten folks and so on. And there's some truth to that. I think there's definitely some kind of symmetry in terms of the quality of information, depending on kind of the ideology you come from. There's this phenomenon of educational polarization where you just have highly educated people more on the left more recently. But I think oftentimes we forget that not everything that people say on the pro-immigration side in particular is also, kind of truthful in a way. And so what Dan Williams and others mean by highbrow misinformation is basically, facts that are not technically incorrect, but they're misleading in a certain way. I would say in general, it's not something that it's fully possible to convey without any framing. So when you present any data or information, right, you have to describe it in some way. There's no way to just like describe it in this kind of neutral way that is completely devoid of any context. And so you have to choose your ways of presenting those facts. And I think what we see in the immigration field is that oftentimes those things are kind of structured in a way to benefit the pro-immigration side, right? You have this kind of whole pipeline if you think about it. So we have very well-meaning, highly educated, and technical researchers doing their research really well. They do really hard work of, getting the data, analyzing it, and then publishing their like high prestige peer review papers in journals, right? And then we have the public offices or like the press release people, trying to hype up the findings. And you probably have seen some of it in your work as well,
Oh, of
right?
course.
Where just by design, you have, simplification happening, right? And when the simplification happening, it's usually not happening in a neutral way. It happens in a way that kind of is advantageous, at least rhetorically, to the pro-immigration side, right? So this nuance kind of gets lost,
So let's
right?
let,
Mm,
let's press on that, Alex, a little bit. So
mm,
lead us through, what do you think are the key points that each side miss? So like let's say there are two sides for the sake of
mhm,
simplification: pro-immigration advocates and there are restrictionists. So what are the key points that
mhm.
both sides miss about the other side?
Yeah, I think this is actually the key question that more folks should be thinking about. So I think, I can start with kind of my own pro-immigration side. I think a lot of people miss, and that's kind of what I call the myth number one in my post is the idea that immigration is primarily about helping the vulnerable. So I can, again, based on my own personal background, I can understand where folks are coming from when they think about it. If you just look at the mobility of people across the world, it is the case that most people move for work or
Yeah.
family reasons, right? They're not necessarily moving because they're forced to move. Um, and I can tell you, like firsthand, like when I started presenting a lot of my research on like high skilled immigration, it was really hard to engage any of my colleagues to care about like, H-1B visas or like business leaders in the US not being able to bring folks to the country because of legal restrictions, right? Because from a certain perspective, people who study immigration usually they don't think of those migrants and categories as the most vulnerable ones. They're not the most disadvantaged ones, and they kind of get lost in this whole information space. We have so many people at the border right now getting harassed or displaced. There's so much violence happening. So, a lot of those kind of regular legal restrictions just don't get enough attention. But I think if you think about it, a lot of those things are exactly the reason why people are trying to, let's say, cross the border illegally, right? So it's not one thing or another. And I just feel like by just focusing almost entirely on the side of vulnerable migrants, I think we're
Okay.
missing a lot of ways how those
You're
people
right.
can actually be helped through other legal channels. Another part of it, which relates more closely to my original empirical research, is that those frames and rhetoric just don't resonate with most voters across the world. So I think people on the pro-immigration side, they oftentimes forget that they're sort of unique in terms of their own values. And so for most folks around the world, basically, you cannot really convince them to help migrants just for humanitarian sake, right? It's
Right,
just not
right.
something that people can relate to, right? You do have to frame things usually in a sense of national interest or self-interest. And again, you can disagree with it morally, but that's just how people's psychology works, unfortunately, or not.
So I think this captures well the question I want to ask you, which is about your book, right? So you have this book, In Our Interest: How Democracies Can Make Immigration Popular. how can democracies make immigration popular? I think you're leading us there, but if you were if you ever have the proverbial magic wand and you're guiding democracies on making immigration popular, what would you suggest democracies do?
Yeah, I mean, I should also acknowledge that the subtitle of the book is Allure. I don't think it's easy or possible to make immigration popular just by
These subtitles always are.
yeah, by changing the way how we talk about it, and that's kinda the main fight that I'm having with a lot of my colleagues is that I don't think it's really a battle of rhetoric or like the way we talk about immigration. Because in the end of the day, a lot of my research that I started with shows that people don't really change their minds that much on the issue, right? And so if there is just one big takeaway from my book, I think it would be this, that the only way to make immigration popular really is to design and implement better policies by the governments in power with some resolve to actually do that. The biggest impediment to that usually is this idea of backlash, right? That if we do something pro immigration, voters are going to be upset and they're going to vote in some, populist, which, is happening around the world. But I do think that there's actually a lot of pragmatic and constructive leverage that mainstream governments have in terms of implementing policies. And by better policies, I mean what I call demonstrably beneficial policies. And here, I would say my biggest intervention is the idea that, like, basically, in order to convince people that immigration is good, it has to be clear to them regardless of where they come from. So basically, you shouldn't have to have a PhD in economics to understand why immigration is good for you and your country, right? So high skilled immigration is probably the closest example that is
Mhm.
very straightforward to most folks. This is, again, despite the fact that immigration is extremely divisive issue, as you mentioned at the very beginning, right? And politically very fraught all around the world. If you look at what people think about skilled immigration, by that we mean like immigration of skilled professionals, educated professionals, people who do jobs that people understand why there's a need for them, like doctors, engineers, even like nurses. So it's like, it's not just, we are talking about PhDs or something, right? It's actually skills are much more diverse than that. In some contexts, it can actually be something about doing some mid-skill work, being a carpenter, or building things, which, we have housing shortages all around the world. And, people actually need those folks who have those skills to help with that. So this is something that is very straightforward and you really don't need to explain to folks why it's needed. And it is fascinating again, then if you look at some of the polls of like Trump voters just before the 2024 elections, it was basically almost even split. So it's like it was 90% support from both Trump and Harris voters basically for
Mhm.
high-skilled immigration and making it legally easier. Despite, the fact that immigration is probably the most divisive issue in terms of, kind of
Right.
between Republicans and Democrats, this particular kind of sub issue or, kind of immigration part of the debate, right? It doesn't seem to be divisive at all, despite the fact that when we know we did have this administration, in the end, they didn't really do much on easing skilled immigration, right? As we know, like,
Right. Right.
and we can talk about that, but yeah. So unfortunately, it seems like there is a division within the Republican Party and the coalition where you have sort of people who are broadly in favor of skilled immigration, like basically the tech sector, a lot of business leaders who traditionally supported Republicans. I mean, President Trump himself famously said a lot of things that are favorable of skilled immigration. But we also have a part of the coalition that is nativist and then that just doesn't like any kinds of immigration. Mostly, you can think of people like Stephen Miller, who have a lot of influence in the current administration, right? And it seems that they definitely kind of prevailed in this particular administration. And so it didn't really help with the skilled
Right.
immigration either.
Let me go to something you wrote. You've written. I like this line. No country needs immigration, but smart countries can choose it. And I think this is what you're getting at and what you're saying now. Can you talk us through this a little bit?
Yeah, so I think that when people kind of move from this kind of humanitarian frame to more national interest frame, which, I think is definitely a good idea based on my research, usually the rhetorical move that I see happening is that you see economists and other social scientists say that the reason why immigration should be open is because our countries need immigration. If we don't increase it or open it up, basically something bad is going to happen. And there's a lot of really good research that goes into it, and there is one way to interpret it. I don't think that's rhetorically a good move because it is also true that you have a lot of wealthy, very stable democracies like, let's say, Japan, where I have spent some time, where you don't really have much immigration, at least until recently. This a frame of saying that we need immigration, I think it's not really something that it's true technically, and also not something that is appealing to a lot of people who disagree with you, right? And I think that's kind of another, I would say, message from my book is that no matter how kind of persuasive your message is, right, you're not going to be able to bring everyone to your side, for better or worse, I guess, because people just disagree, and there are some very, um, you know, not just empirical, but moral disagreements in terms of how should we message or manage migration or whatnot.
Let me just ask you this question: Are democracies better or worse than other political systems at managing immigration?
I mean, that's actually a very good question because you would think that political scientists, and that's kind of my
Yes.
home discipline, would pay more attention to something like this, but I actually haven't heard much done on this. I mean, obviously, we have a lot of really good research done on immigration in non-democracies. I don't think there has been a lot of good comparative research. Democracies and democracies, I would say, kind of from my perspective as a public opinion scholar, sometimes actually the differences between democracies and non-democracies are somewhat exaggerated. Because, even if you live in a somewhat authoritarian state, let's say like Putin's Russia right now, right?
Mhm.
You still care to some extent about public opinion, right? You still don't want to have people rebel or protest or have like a very significant backlash. Yeah, I mean, you are probably not obligated as much to respond to that. That's kind of the main advantage I see of democracy, at least when it comes to immigration, is that you do have this kind of feedback loop, right? At least in theory. And I think it does kind of work in practice where if the government in power does something that is completely opposite of what people want, then, they're just voted out effectively, right? And then you have to change the course. While in authoritarian regimes, you don't really have that. From the perspective of migration and like, let's say, global well-being, it's actually somewhat complicated, I would say, because, there are some people like, for instance, Martin Brewers, I have his book, The
Mhm.
Price of Rights, which is a really great book. I highly recommend to everyone, where he talks about the Gulf countries, which, again, oftentimes are portrayed as those kind of exploitative states for migrants, right? And there's a lot of truth to that, but also there's a lot of diversity. And, let's say the migrant conditions in the Emirates are much better than in Saudi Arabia, and they have
Yeah.
changed recently. But it's also the case that, because those states are not democracies and they can afford to invite a lot of foreigners and foreign workers, those folks don't get full rights, but they also get a lot of work and the possibilities to migrate, right? So there's this kind of trade-off between, giving people and foreigners a lot of rights and inviting just more of them. And from a certain perspective, if you, let's say, live in a developing country like Bangladesh and you want to feed your family, I think, from your perspective, probably it would be much better to go and working Saudi Arabia for a couple of years and send a bunch of remittances back home and actually get better off from that than, just try to migrate to the US or Europe with, again, very little chance of doing so. And then in most cases, you're just not going to be able to do that. So I feel like there is this important trade off that a lot of people don't realize. And I think non democracies are more able to allow for this trade-off of, giving fewer rights to foreigners, which again, it's sort of like a very uncomfortable thing to think about for a lot of pro-immigration advocates who want to have more foreigners with more rights, which again is very understandable. But to the extent that we have this trade-off between rights and numbers, I think that maybe there is some advantage of democracy. Again, it's not necessarily my endorsement of not having a democracy, but I think when it comes to immigration in particular, you have this kind of interesting
Yeah.
situation where non-democracies can actually allowing more global poor folks to
Yeah.
make money.
I think I know the answer to the next question, but because your thinking is very nuanced about this, but let me ask it anyway. So, is there a country you can point to that is doing immigration right?
Probably not. Yeah, I mean,
I thought you
if
were going to say that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if there was, yeah, I wouldn't have any job, right?
Mhm.
But I think there are definitely a few countries that are doing it better than others. Yeah, I mean, again, immigration is especially dysfunctional, especially if you compare immigration to a lot of other issues that are facing the world and, different receiving countries, it's definitely, I would say, much more dysfunctional and convoluted than some of the other ones, even like climate change, I would say. It's interesting, like, if you look at what people trust their government on various issues, and in general, we have a kind of loss of trust among many folks and governments across the world. But immigration is usually the issue where countries and voters trust the least their governments on. And there's one exception that I know of where actually there is quite a lot of trust, and it's Canada. And so I do talk a lot about Canada in my book, and I think they've made a lot of mistakes, but all in all, I don't think any country does it better, at least in terms of having a sustainable, relatively high and open immigration, which is kind of both good for the receiving country and, for the migrants themselves. And I think the reason for that, it's not because Canada has some kind of unique cultural profile. I don't think that Canadians are necessarily much more cosmopolitan or humanitarian oriented than, let's say, Brits or Americans. I do think a lot of it kind of comes back to the policy design and how it kind of historically got implemented. I do think that having a very straightforward system helps. I think a lot of people kind of associate the success of Canada with their point-based system, and there's something to that. And for listeners who are not aware of it, is basically so anyone can go to the government website for immigration in Canada and see whether they qualify under the point-based system, how many points they get, given their education, language capabilities, and things like that, their age, and then see if they can qualify. And it's a very simple system. And I think that's actually more important than actually assigning points, is having a system that is very transparent and easy to understand. And, compare it to, let's say, the US system where we have this proverbial alphabet of soup of visa categories and whatnot, right? So I think Canada is certainly the country that does it better than others. That said, obviously, Canada also made a lot of mistakes. Like one thing that comes to my mind, for instance, is initially they were not really awarding points for having a job offer, and they had this very unfortunate problem of, let's say, Indian PhDs driving cabs in Toronto, right? And this was highly criticized by migration researchers and advocates and policymakers, and they adopted and they changed it. So again, it was a flaw in their system, and they changed it. I think one good thing about Canada is that for various political reasons, they have a very professional, independent immigration bureaucracy that is not as haphazard as, like, what we have in the US, where it changes every single time we have a new administration, right? So I
Right.
think that definitely helps. Yeah, so we have Canada. A lot of other countries are making certain decisions that are right. I've been thinking a lot about Japan recently, which hasn't really had much immigration until recently. And, if you talk to like big Japan scholars, they would tell you that Japan is just a country that would never accept any immigrants. It's just not in their culture or whatever. But now we see that it's changing, and it's going pretty well so far. They like quadrupled the number of foreign workers and immigrants over the last 5 to 10 years, and it doesn't seem to cause any significant backlash. A lot of it is really because Japan really benefit a lot from immigration in a straightforward way, just for like demographics reasons. That is not something that is as apparent in some of the other countries. And I think this is kind of the key here again, is that you really need to have a straightforward idea why immigration is needed uh, in a certain place.
So you used that was a terrific answer, by the way, and I'm delighted you mentioned Japan because you're right. It's not a country that many people think of as a country that has historically been open to immigration. To hear that a country can evolve on these issues, I think gives hope. You used the word sustainable when you were talking about answering my question about what country does immigration right. So, if you were to extend the lessons you have learned from your work and for what others have learned from their work, what would a sustainable, humane status quo on immigration look like in the U.S.?
Oh, in the US in particular.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
yeah,
this is such a hot issue
yeah,
here.
yeah. No, so I think the problem with the US, as I see it, is that we have our Congress that is not very functional right now, that is beyond immigration, right? So, to the extent that immigration is supposed to be done legislatively, it's hard for me to imagine how we can have like a comprehensive immigration reform anytime soon, which, by the way, it hasn't happened for a very long time, right?
Yes. Since the
Uh,
80s, right?
Yeah. So there's a structural reason why it's hard to get things right in the US. I think for the US in particular, I think there's certain kind of targeted things we can do to make it better and more sustainable. Just focusing on some of the kind of more controversial issues. I'm thinking about like humanitarian immigration and this kind of backlash that we had recently uh, that potentially had helped Trump get reelected again with the surge of asylum seekers during the Biden administration, right? If we had um, a more privatized refugee resettlement system, like for instance they have in Canada, I think that would have helped, right? Given that we also had a very significant surge in labor demand among employers, if those folks could actually sponsor those visas as opposed to, getting those people through like asylum process or illegally, I think that would have helped. I mean, all of this requires some congressional action, right? But to the extent that we can have those kind of targeted
Mhm.
reforms, for instance, just like streamlining things. I mean, I think there's a lot of kind of things that don't really divide Republicans and Democrats, both among voters and congressional members. If I could single out, let's say, one or two things, I would probably say investing in higher administrative capacity. That would be like one kind of key solution to a lot of problems that we have, right? Because it's basically something that should be appealing to both pro-immigration and anti-immigration side. Because right now, the status quo is that you apply for asylum, you apply for a visa, and you wait for a very, very long time, usually much longer than in Canada or any other country. And some of the, there's certain like factoids, which are just fascinating. If you are trying to get a green card through your family member and you're from Mexico or some of the other countries that are having a lot of visas, and we have this kind of per country cap rule where, you only can have a certain number of green cards from a certain country every year, right, as a percentage, which, disadvantages Mexico, China, and India, bigger countries with more migrants, right? And basically, if some of those folks who, again, legally eligible to get their status, but they have to wait for like 10 or 20 years sometimes. Does it make sense? I don't think so, right? And I don't think people on the restrictionist side also think that. So I think just kind of hiring more people, more bureaucrats, making the process more efficient so that people get processed faster, which by the way would include and imply that people can also get deported faster as well, right? If you process, let's say, asylum applications faster, it means that people are not going to get released into the country and stay legally potentially, or in some kind of quasi-legal status, right? They would have to be deported faster, which, is a tough pill to swallow for a lot of pro-immigration advocates, but I think that would be one implication of that, right? But I think kind of increasing this capacity to make sure that people know where they stand and what their options are, I think that would be a huge win-win-win for all sides.
My last question, Alex. So, what space for progress on immigration do you see in the US and globally? What's giving you hope in the moment?
That's something I have to think about. I mean, I think my hope comes from the fact that a lot of the opposition that we see to immigration is not inherent or categorical, as I usually call it. It's conditional. So it's not really the fact that people oppose immigration no matter what. It really depends on the policies on the ground. And to the extent that the governments in power can change those, at least marginally, for the better, can make the politics of the issue more healthy. It is a very unfortunate situation wherein the current status quo is not ideal for anyone. That's what I would say is probably the biggest misconception among folks on the restrictionist side, going back to some of your earlier questions, is that a lot of them don't really realize how restrictive the system is already. So I feel like people see the headlines that people are trying to sneak across the border or we like accepted that number of like refugees or whatnot. And they don't realize that basically there are no opportunities for any legal pathway. So in the US, for instance, right now, if you don't have a family member or a job offer and a skill, you basically have no avenues for migration at all. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that the US needs or is obligated to admit anyone from anywhere in the world, but it just explains why it is happening in the first place. And I think to the extent that we can make the system work better in a productive way that like a lot of sides agree, I think that something that gives me hope that the situation can be solved, right? And again, we do have just, examples of countries where it does work to a certain extent. Again, like Canada, despite, some of the recent kind of backlash to the misuse of student visas, which you probably are familiar with, right? There basically were a lot of kind of lower tier universities, especially private schools, who were just mostly inviting folks from abroad to give them a legal status essentially instead of providing education. And so that did not work well for the system, right? But we still have a pretty big consensus on what people want from immigration in Canada. It's not really politically polarizing, right? The People's Party of Canada is not really something that is polling well anywhere. So it doesn't necessarily have to be like a right or left issue. And I would say my ideal, which gives me some hope, is just to make immigration boring, make it boring again, right? So I think the problem right now that it's a very salient technical issue that seems very easy and emotional to folks. So people have ideas about how to change it for the better or worse. But in my ideal world, it just would be a boring technocratic thing that people just don't care about.
Mhm.
And we would just have those bureaucrats in those government offices programmatically deciding on whether to grant you a visa or not based on your qualifications or other characteristics. And no one would like be upset about it, if that makes sense.
Well, you had to work hard to come up with hope, but you did come to a place of hope. I am Sandro Galea. I have been speaking with Dr. Alexander Kustov about immigration in a changing world. Thank you, Alex, for this conversation.
Thank you so
And,
much for having me.
and thank you to everybody who has joined us for this episode of Ideas Matter. I look forward to continuing the conversation.